Now that you've reviewed the meiosis in the male, we're now going to look at the process of meiosis in a female. The basics are the same. Meiosis is meiosis, but it gets a little more complicated in the female because a few things are going to be different. So first we're going to look at the process of meiosis, when it occurs, what happens, how does it look different, and then we'll look at it within the realm of looking at the ovary, okay, within the realm of looking at the ovary. So when we look at meiosis in the female, right, let me go back and forth here. So here's comparison male-female. All right, so instead of a spermatogonia, you start with an oogonia, which is 2N. Okay, you have 46 diploid, you have 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs. In the male, the spermatogonia goes through mitosis throughout life to become primary spermatocytes. So they go through mitosis from puberty on to get to primary spermatocytes. In a female, the process of oogonia to a primary oocyte only happens early in fetal development. So females, when you were like itty bitty bitty bitty, like a month after conception, your oogonias would start the process of mitosis. By 3 months into fetal development, all your oogonias, mitosis has stopped. Okay, mitosis has stopped. So this process of mitosis going from an oogonia to a primary spermatocyte only happens early in fetal development. So again, in males, it happens from puberty on. In females, early in fetal development, and that's it. So the ones you're born with are the ones you will have when you go through puberty. They're the ones you will have when you're 40, 45, and then at some point you will run out. Primary oocyte. So oogonia to primary oocyte happens early in fetal development. It also, meiosis 1 also starts. Meiosis 1 also starts and then stops, actually, I think in prophase 1. So meiosis 1, so mitosis happens in the developing fetus, starts meiosis, but stops in meiosis 1. So females, what females are born with, they are born with primary oocytes that have started through meiosis 1 but stopped. So what you're actually born with is a primary oocyte that has started meiosis 1 but stopped there. So when a little baby girl is born, whatever's in her ovaries are primary oocytes that have just started meiosis 1 but not completed it. Okay. Now, once the girl hits puberty, what will start to happen is one oocyte will start to mature each month. Okay. Will start to mature each month once puberty starts. Meiosis 1 will be finished right before ovulation of that month. So whatever oocyte has started to mature will finish meiosis 1 right before ovulation. Just to review, ovulation is when the oocyte is going to go into the fallopian tubes, the oviducts, and can possibly be fertilized. So a secondary oocyte does not exist until right before ovulation. So right before ovulation, meiosis 1 will finish. You'll have a secondary oocyte. That's what will be ovulated. That is what will leave the ovary and head into the oviducts. Now, one thing I want you to notice a difference here. In meiosis 1, in the male, you had 2 secondary spermatocytes. In a female, the cytokinesis is not equal. Each cell does not get equal amount of cytoplasm. So you get one secondary oocyte that is functional, and you get what's called a polar body. This does not have enough other stuff in order to survive, so it dies off, and it may actually be ovulated, but nothing can happen at that point. So another difference is here. Okay, you get a polar body in equal or unequal cytokinesis, and so you get a polar body. So again, meiosis 1 finishes in the primary oocyte to become a secondary oocyte right before ovulation. The secondary oocyte is what is ovulated and can become fertilized. It will actually start meiosis 2. Okay, so secondary oocyte is what is ovulated. Now, if that oocyte that's been ovulated is never fertilized by a sperm, that's it. Okay, you just have a secondary oocyte that does not go on, and the woman will not become pregnant. Fertilization will not occur. If the secondary oocyte is fertilized by a sperm, then meiosis II will finish, and then you will have an ovum. So a female doesn't ever have in her body a ovum or finish meiosis II unless it has been fertilized. So meiosis II will not finish. You will not have an ovum, which has 23 chromosomes. It's haploid unless fertilization has occurred. Okay, unless fertilization has occurred. All right, let's look at that again. Oogonia to primary oocyte is mitosis. That only happens early in fetal development in the female. Females are born with primary oocytes that have started meiosis I. They will only finish meiosis I if ovulation, or right before ovulation. So right before ovulation, it finishes meiosis I, and a secondary oocyte is what is ovulated. If the secondary oocyte is fertilized by a sperm, then meiosis II finishes and you end up with an ovum, which has 23 chromosomes, is haploid or one end. Don't worry about this otid right here. You'll also notice when the secondary oocyte goes through meiosis II, you end up with another polar body. Okay, you end up with another polar body. So from one oogonia to a primary oocyte, you end up with one ovum. And you only end up with that ovum if it has been fertilized. Okay, if it has been fertilized. 46 chromosomes, 23 chromosomes. Okay. Again, differences here. This can occur in sperm and men from puberty for the rest of their lives, only early in fetal development. You don't get polar bodies, you get equal division in the males during meiosis I and meiosis II. So one primary spermatocyte or spermatogonia ends up as 4 spermatozoa. In a female, one oogonia or primary oocyte, you end up with only one ovum, not 4. The other ones are lost because the cytokinesis, the division, is not equal. The rest are lost as polar bodies. Okay, the rest are lost as polar bodies. Oogonia to primary oocyte is mitosis. Primary oocyte to secondary oocyte, meiosis I, only finishes right before ovulation in the one primary oocyte per month. Secondary oocyte to ovum only occurs if fertilization has occurred, and that is meiosis II. Okay. So again, you might need to listen to that again to go through the process and to look at the differences between them. This picture here gives you a better idea about the polar bodies, okay, about the polar bodies. So you can look at this, the same principle. So you kind of end up with 4, but you don't, because you end up, if this polar body goes through division here, these two are not functional because this one's not functional. So the point is, instead of ending with 4, instead of ending with 4, like you do with sperm in the male, you end up with one ovum from one oogonia and one primary oocyte. Okay. Now, to add more confusion, we now need to look at a terminology and looking at what's happening in the ovary with the follicle as well as the oocyte. So here's the image of the ovary that you will be using. All right. And what you have in an ovary is you have oocytes, but you also have follicles. Okay, you also have follicles. What a follicle is, it's an oocyte plus the cells around that oocyte. Again, the follicle is an oocyte with cells around it, okay, with the cells around it. So you're going to have a follicle with an oocyte in the center, okay, a follicle with an oocyte in the center. Now where it gets confusing is because you have a primary oocyte in a primary follicle or a secondary follicle. Okay. So you have to distinguish between the follicle and what oocyte that follicle has in it. Okay, so let's look at this first. So this is an ovary. Remember I told you females are born with all the primary oocytes they will ever have. Those primary oocytes are in what are called primordial follicles. So primordial follicle is a very tiny follicle with a primary oocyte in it. Okay, with a primary oocyte in it. That's what a female, when a baby female is born, look in the ovaries, you're going to find primordial follicles with primary oocytes in them. When the female then starts going through puberty and the right hormonal signals occur, every month one or a couple primordial follicles are going to start to mature. So at puberty, in response to hormones, a primordial follicle, we're just going to stick with one, a primordial follicle starts to mature. Okay, it starts to mature. The hormones involved with that we will go over in lecture. Okay. So the beginning of a female cycle, in response to hormones, a primordial follicle is going to start to mature. Okay, a primordial follicle is going to start to mature. What I mean by maturing is the follicle is going to start to grow. The follicle is going to start to grow. It's going to grow more cells around it. Those cells are going to secrete more hormones like estrogen. All right, those hormones are going to start to get the uterus ready. That's the menstrual cycle. We'll do that separately. All right, so throughout the first half of the menstrual cycle, the first 14 days, a primordial follicle is going to mature into a primary follicle right here. This primary follicle still has a primary oocyte in it. So from primordial follicle to primary follicle, what has changed is the follicle has gotten bigger. The cells around the oocyte have gotten bigger, but it's still a primary oocyte. It's still a primary oocyte. Then, as we go through more towards the middle of the cycle, that follicle is going to continue to mature and get bigger right here. That is called a secondary follicle, but it's a secondary follicle that has a primary oocyte in it. Ovulation has not occurred yet, so meiosis 1 has not finished. It's not complete. So we go from a primordial follicle to a primary follicle, still with a primary oocyte, from a primary follicle to a secondary follicle, but still with a primary oocyte. So the follicle is getting larger around the primary oocyte. There's more cells, there's more hormones. What these hormones are doing, primarily estrogen, is preparing the uterine lining for possible implantation. Okay, for possible implantation of a developing embryo. Okay, so now we're towards the middle of the menstrual cycle. The follicle is mature. It's a mature follicle, which is represented by this. What it's saying is the uterine lining, we've got enough hormones. The body is ready for fertilization for possible implantation. So this is a mature follicle. Right before ovulation, and what ovulation is when this oocyte is going to leave the ovary and head into the oviducts for possible fertilization. If there are sperm there. Right before this mature follicle releases this oocyte, the primary oocyte is going to finish meiosis 1 and become a secondary oocyte. So what is actually being ovulated right here is a secondary oocyte. So we have this mature follicle. We're ready. The body's ready. That primary oocyte is going to finish meiosis 1 and become a secondary oocyte, and then is ovulated into the oviducts, fallopian tubes, where if there's sperm there, it can possibly become fertilized. Okay. Now remember, this secondary oocyte is released. If it is fertilized, If it is fertilized, it will go through meiosis 2 and become an ovum, okay, and become an ovum. So after fertilization, after a sperm fertilizes that ovum, it will finish meiosis 2 and become an ovum, okay, and become an ovum. So in these follicles, primordial, primary, secondary, you have primary oocytes. You do not have a secondary oocyte until right before ovulation. The primary oocyte becomes a secondary oocyte by finishing meiosis 1. The primary oocyte goes through meiosis 1, become a secondary oocyte. The secondary oocyte is what is ovulated. If that secondary oocyte becomes fertilized, it will then finish meiosis 2 and become an ovum. Then completes fertilization, and then you have a developing embryo. Okay. Now, to continue on what happens with the ovary, to review the ovary, the oocyte and a few of the cells around it are going to be ovulated. The rest of the follicle, the rest of these cells that are left in the follicle, are going to become what's called the corpus luteum, which means yellow body. Okay. This corpus luteum is going to control the menstrual cycle during the second half. So the menstrual cycle is the first half, ovulation is what separates the halves, and then the corpus luteum is going to take over. It's actually called the luteal phase from the ovary standpoint. This corpus luteum is going to secrete hormones that are going to help maintain, okay, if fertilization occurs, will help maintain the developing embryo and the uterine lining. Okay. If 2 weeks after ovulation, no fertilization has taken place, so there's no developing embryo, this corpus luteum will die and become what is called the corpus albicans, which is pretty much like scar tissue in the ovary. Okay, in the ovary. So after ovulation, you have this corpus luteum. This is still preparing the uterus, okay, for possible implantation. If after 2 weeks there is no fertilization, there is no embryo there, then the corpus luteum becomes the corpus albicans, the scar tissue. So really the corpus albicans a female has on her ovary are scar tissues of previous ovulations. Okay. This over here is just showing you right after ovulation, you have this mature follicle that is becoming the corpus luteum. Okay, becoming the corpus luteum. So what you need to do is first understand the process of meiosis and how you go from an oogonium to an ovum, when they occur, when they occur, what causes them to occur, and so on. Okay. Then you need to tie that in. This is the same thing. I just didn't use this. If you want to look at it, this PowerPoint's in Google Classroom, you can. I just went straight to the ovary and tried to describe it there. The key here is to distinguish between a follicle and an oocyte, and a primary follicle and a primary oocyte, a secondary follicle, okay, and a primary oocyte versus a secondary oocyte, and so on. Okay, so you just need to go through those and make sure that you're clear on the differences. Okay, on the differences. Okay, if you have any questions, and this takes a little bit of time. It usually takes going over more than once. Take some notes, go through the video. If you have questions after that, then make sure you ask me.